For as long as anyone could remember, the Plains Cree had lived by the bison, and the bison had made them one of the strongest peoples on the northern plains of what is now Western Canada. It is hard, from here, to grasp how completely their whole world rested on that one animal. The bison were food dried into pemmican that could feed a family through the hardest winter. They were shelter, their hides stretched into the great lodges. They were clothing, tools, cord, containers, fuel. The seasonal rhythm of the Cree year moved with the herds. The hunt shaped the leadership, the ceremonies, the sharing that held a band together. A man like Poundmaker earned his very name Pihtokahanapiwiyin from his skill at building the buffalo pounds, the great corrals into which the herds were guided and taken. The bison were not a resource the Cree happened to use. They were the foundation everything else stood on. And the Cree knew their country the way you know a thing your life depends on. They knew where the herds moved and when, where water ran in a dry year, where the passes and the crossings and the wintering grounds lay. They knew the land not as a map, but as a home, in a detail no outsider could match. This was one of the great strengths of the Plains peoples. They were not wanderers lost in a wilderness. They were a sophisticated, self-governing nation, at home in a country they understood completely. The Cree were also a people of movement and trade, not isolation. For generations, they had been central players in the great fur trade networks that reached across the continent, dealing with the Hudson's Bay Company and its rivals, carrying the pemmican that provisioned the whole trade. They were skilled diplomats and negotiators, tied by kinship and alliance to neighboring nations, and used to bargaining with powerful outsiders on something close to equal terms. When the plains were still whole, the Cree were not a people to be pushed around. They dealt with newcomers from a position of real strength. That is the world that stood on the northern plains in the 1870s, a Cree world, ancient and confident and whole, built on the bison and the deep knowledge of the land. And in the space of only a few years, it fell apart. The animal that everything depended on simply vanished, faster and more completely than anyone had believed possible, and the vanishing changed everything that came after. The bison had once moved across the plains in numbers that stunned every European who saw them. Herds that took days to pass, that shook the ground, that seemed as endless as the grass itself. No one imagined they could ever run out. They ran out anyway. Through the 1870s, the great herds were destroyed with terrible speed. Commercial hunters slaughtered them by the millions for their hides, leaving the meat to rot. The killings swept up from the American plains and closed in from every side, and the herds that had always come north thinned and then failed and then were gone. By the early 1880s, the bison had all but disappeared from the Canadian plains entirely. A people who had lived on them for countless generations looked out across the grass and saw nothing. There is an argument, still debated, about how deliberate that destruction was. Some of it was raw commercial greed. Hides were worth money, and the market seemed bottomless. But many at the time understood, and some openly welcomed, a harder truth: that destroying the bison destroyed the independence of the Plains nations. A people who could feed themselves could not easily be controlled. A people whose food had been wiped out could be. Whatever the mix of motives, the effect was the same, and it fell on the Cree like the end of the world. What followed was a catastrophe with few equals in the history of the continent. The Plains Cree faced starvation, not a hard season, but the collapse of the entire basis of their life all at once. Families who had never known real hunger watched their children weaken. Bands that had been strong and independent were reduced within a few winters to desperation. The pemmican was gone. The hunt was gone. The future the whole society had been built to secure was gone. Try to feel the weight of that. Everything you knew how to do, every skill, every rhythm, every certainty your parents and grandparents had lived by, suddenly useless because the animal it all depended on had been wiped from the earth in your own lifetime. The Cree were not a broken people. They were a capable, proud, intelligent nation facing a disaster that would have shattered anyone. And it was into that moment of maximum desperation, a starving people, their world collapsed beneath them, that two things arrived on the plains together, hand in hand, and closed the trap. One was a government that had learned it could use hunger as a tool. The other was a railway. By 1882, the Canadian Pacific Railway was racing westward across the prairies, and ahead of the track layers came the surveyors, men with chains and transits and stakes, walking the open plains, measuring the land into a grid, marking where the line would run and where the country would be carved up for the settlers who would follow. The survey itself was a quiet kind of conquest. Across the whole of the prairies, the land was being cut into a vast rectangular grid of townships and sections, neat squares on paper that took no account of the rivers, the hunting grounds, the seasonal camps, or the peoples who had shaped their lives around them for centuries. To draw that grid was to declare, in the language of ink and instruments, that this was now surveyable, sellable, settler land. The stakes the surveyors drove into the sod were the first fence posts of a new order. The Cree understood exactly what they were watching. This was not a mystery to them. The Iron Road was the end of the open plains. It would bring farmers and towns and fences across the last free grassland in a flood, and it would bind the whole territory to a distant government in a way no treaty on paper ever could. Where the railway went, the old life could not follow. They could see their world being measured for its replacement, stake by stake in real time. The Cree could read that meaning perfectly. They had heard what was happening to indigenous peoples further south and east as settlers and their railroads advanced. They knew that the line creeping across the horizon was not just a convenience for travelers. It was the leading edge of the thing that would remake and try to erase their entire way of being. And here is the part worth understanding clearly, without any invented mystery attached to it. The Cree possessed exactly the knowledge those surveyors and settlers most lacked: the intimate understanding of the land, its water, its seasons, its roots, built up over generations. They knew where a newcomer would thrive and where he would fail. And they had every reason on earth not to hand that knowledge freely to the men who were mapping their homeland out from under them. What the elders withheld, in other words, was not a spooky secret buried in the ground. It was cooperation. It was legitimacy. It was the last leverage a dispossessed people had left: the refusal to make the taking of their country easy, to smile on it, to teach the newcomers the land as though handing it over were natural and right. That refusal was a form of resistance, quiet and real, and it deserves to be seen as exactly that, rather than dressed up as some hidden treasure or curse. But refusal has limits when your children are starving. And the government building that railway knew it, because it had already decided to use the one weapon against which Cree strength and Cree knowledge had no answer at all. The man who wielded that weapon was Edgar Dewdney, the government's Indian commissioner in the Northwest, and his policy was as simple as it was cruel. The government controlled the rations now, the emergency food that stood between the Cree and death. And Dewdney used it. Food, under his hand, became a tool of control. Rations were given to bands that took treaty and moved onto the reserves the government had chosen for them, and withheld from bands that resisted, that stayed out, that tried to hold onto their independence. A starving people were offered a single bargain: submit, settle where you are told, accept the new order, and you may eat. Refuse, and you may watch your family die on the open plain you had always been free to roam. It was starvation turned into policy, hunger turned into a lever to break a nation's will. So the rations were kept flowing to the compliant and choked off from the defiant, band by band, until unity became almost impossible to sustain. You cannot hold a common front when each group is starving separately and being offered food only for its surrender. Hunger did not just break bodies. It was used, deliberately, to break the very possibility of resistance. Against this, the greatest of the holdouts was Big Bear, Mr. Himasqua. Years earlier, in 1876, when many Cree bands had signed Treaty 6, Big Bear had refused. He was not against dealing with the government. He understood the bison were failing and that some accommodation would have to come. But he wanted better terms, real guarantees, and above all, he wanted the Cree to negotiate together, as one people, from strength, rather than be picked off band by band. For years, through the whole collapse of the herds, he held out, trying to unite the Cree to bargain for a future they could actually live in. His stand has sometimes been misremembered as stubbornness or as simple hostility to the treaties. It was neither. He grasped, more clearly than almost anyone, the danger of the Cree signing away their land piece by piece, each band alone and desperate, with no unity and no leverage. He wanted the Cree to come together and negotiate as one people, so that whatever bargain was struck would actually protect them. It was a far-sighted, statesmanlike idea, and the government understood that a united Cree nation was exactly what it could not allow, and worked to prevent it. It was a long, principled struggle, and hunger finally ended it. By the winter of 1882, with his people dying and the rations dangled just out of reach, Big Bear was left with the arithmetic that Dewdney had designed for him. Hold to his principles and let his band starve, or take treaty and let them eat. In December of 1882, at Fort Walsh in the Cypress Hills, he took treaty at last. It was not the breaking of his spirit. It was a father choosing his children's lives over his own last leverage. That is the true shape of what happened on the plains in 1882. Not a hidden secret refused, but a people cornered by the vanishing of the bison, by the coming of the railway, and by a government willing to starve them onto their knees. So the trap closed. Within a few short years, the Cree lost the bison, lost the freedom of the open plains, and were pushed onto reserves whose boundaries other men had drawn. The railway was finished, the settlers poured in, and the grassland that had fed a nation was fenced and ploughed and renamed. The promises made in the treaties, the famine relief, the help to build a new life, were too often broken or delivered too late to matter. The years just after 1882 grew darker still. The pressures that had been building the hunger, the broken promises, the loss of freedom helped ignite the Northwest resistance of 1885, after which the government cracked down hard, tightening its grip on the reserves and punishing those it blamed. The system that followed the reserves, the pass laws that controlled indigenous movement, the residential schools that took the children would inflict damage that echoes to this day. It is easy to tell the story of the railway as a triumph, all golden spikes and nation building, and to leave this part out entirely. For a very long time, that is exactly how it was told. But the plains were not empty when the surveyors came. They were somebody's home, and the building of the iron road across them was, for the Cree, the machinery of their dispossession. Naming this is not an attack on the country that grew up here. It is simply the other half of a story that was told, for generations, with that half left out. The railway was a genuine feat. It was also, for the peoples whose land it crossed, a catastrophe. Both of those things are true at once. And yet, and this is the part that matters most, the Cree were not erased. This is not a story of a vanished people. Big Bear, even after everything, kept speaking for his people's rights, and is remembered now as one of the earliest advocates for the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Through the reserves, through the broken promises, through the residential schools, and the long, hard century that followed, the Cree endured. They are still here, on that same land, raising their children and keeping their language and telling their own history in their own voice. Because that is the thing the elders never surrendered, whatever the surveyors took. They never surrendered the knowledge of who they were, or the conviction that the land had been theirs, and the taking of it was a wrong. The surveyors got the country onto their maps. The government got the treaties signed. But the deepest thing, the Cree belief in their own peoplehood and their own claim, could not be measured or rationed or staked out, and it did not die when the bison did. So the honest answer to what the Cree held back from the men mapping their world in 1882 is not a legend and not a mystery. It is the truth that has taken this country more than a century to finally hear. That a whole nation was starved and cornered and dispossessed to make way for a railway, and that the people it was done to never accepted that it was just and never went away, and are the ones telling the story now.